Hi everyone, welcome to Friday's edition of Indycar. I'm Gordon Ross, today I'm in Partick, and today I'm talking about, well, all kinds of things actually. There's a lot going on at the moment. After the dust settled on yesterday's Indycar and the comments I made about what I felt was a rather timid response from the SNP in London to the events in Syria. After all the dust settled on that, I've decided just to leave that subject alone. I didn't intend to go SNP bashing. I was just mystified by the response. I do appreciate there are other circumstances at play in London, and I am sure that in many cases the SNP just has to play along with the Westminster pantomime for the time being, bide their time until the situation stabilises and we get a chance to see how Brexit is panning out. Now, speaking of Brexit, has brought me to a little covered story this morning, one which I'm sure the BBC and the rest of the state media really doesn't want you to know about, which is that the European Brexit negotiators have systematically, completely destroyed and rejected the British government's plans for a frictionless border in Northern Ireland. They have rejected out of hand all attempts by British negotiators to convince them that a mysterious new system of non-border controls can be invented within the next 2 years in time for the final split between Britain and the EU. So, the upshot of all of this is that Britain is now faced in its negotiating stance, as it were, to accept the truth that it either has to stay in the customs union or there must be a hard border in Ireland. The European Union has reduced the amount of wiggle room that the British government has to zero. There is now a choice of you're either in or you're out of the currency union. Not currency union. You're either in and out of the customs union. Too many unions here. So the British government now has to decide how it can stay in the customs union when it has already said that there's no way it's going to stay in the customs union. The British government's red lines were that they wouldn't be in the customs union because that meant free movement of people, and they were not going to stay in the single market, which meant that they would have to do some kind of external trade deal. But they can't do an external trade deal because they won't accept freedom of movement. So whichever way the British government twists and turns, it has built itself a cage that it can't get out of. It painted itself into a corner, it's in a cleft stick. The kinds of metaphors you can use for this are endless. But basically the government is between a rock and a hard place. And in fact, between a rock and a hard place, in a corner with their backs against the wall, in a cleft stick. There's nowhere for them to go with Brexit. And the time is drawing near now where they're going to have to decide that hard Brexit is the only Brexit that there can be. And we all knew this was going to happen. It was just a question of how long it would take for the European negotiators to destroy all the arguments that the British government are making for this ridiculous frictionless border. So that's now happened, and the Brexit negotiations are moving on now to the substantive issue of are you in or are you out? Because basically that's what the question is. The European Union is fed up listening to the British prevarications and procrastinating about how they're going to do this, that and the next thing. They've not done a single thing, and they know they can't because there's no solution to this problem. That was the first thing. In the meantime, the BBC is still distracting everybody's attention with all these ridiculous scare stories about Russia. I mean, I've heard some ridiculous ones. I think my favourite one is ships lurking near undersea cables. Now, ships lurking near undersea cables is a ridiculous thing to even state. A ship can lurk near any cable. It doesn't mean it's doing anything. It doesn't mean it's lurking. It might just be sailing over a site of a cable. There are hundreds of cables which cross the Atlantic from Europe, and it's very hard not to sail over them. The point that they're trying to make, though, is that the British state media would have you believe that it is somehow possible for the Russians to design a deep submersible sort of sabotage submarine which could robotically clamp onto an internet cable, cut into it, and start mucking about with the data flowing down those fibre optics. Now, as any scientist or engineer will tell you, that is absolutely impossible to do. It's impossible to do it on dry land, never mind hundreds of feet under the ocean by a remote-controlled submarine. So another load of nonsense coming out of the British state media. Add to that this week the revelation that one of the young boys who appeared in the recent video, which purported to show children having been gassed and being treated in a medical station, one of the young boys who was in that video was found and interviewed on television with his father, and he tells a very different story from what's presented in the British press. His story was that he and his mother and his family were in a shelter underneath the city. There'd been a lot of shelling and bombing, bit of dust, but he was told, I could hear shouting outside, and he was told by adults to go to the medical centre and to bring his family. So they all dutifully turned up at the medical centre, where he was grabbed by a white helmet and basically manoeuvred inside and doused with water for no apparent reason that he knew of, because there was nothing wrong with him. His father said that he had come looking for the family. He was working as a construction worker rebuilding some of the damaged buildings, and he came as soon as he heard that there had been some kind of incident. And he said he was standing outside in the street. There was no smell of gas, there was no smoke, there was no dust, there had been no bombing, and he was told his family were inside the medical centre and he could go and get them. And he brought his mystified family out of the medical centre with no idea of what had happened or why they had been summoned there. And the child told the story that the white helmets had actually rewarded all the children who took part in this video with sweets and biscuits and cakes, just basically treats, because they were all pretty hungry. They hadn't eaten for a couple of days. So it's a very different story from what we're actually being presented with in our own media. And the more you think about it, the more you look at what's coming out of the BBC, and also its, what shall we say, its political programming like Question Time, its other set pieces will bring in a lot of politicians, a lot of journalists, a lot of actors and well-known people who will just simply want to go on and on about Russian aggression and to build up this narrative into some kind of war cry again. There seems to be no end to the war crimes that we can attribute to Russia without any evidence whatsoever. And it's worrying that the British state media can lie with such ease and without any repercussions, and politicians like Theresa May can continue to lie to Parliament, to other world leaders, to involve them in military action on the basis of a lie, have the lie then proved to be a lie in all the world's media, and no apology, no, oh I'm sorry we got it wrong, nothing, just move on to the next lie. So it's getting a bit tiresome. Anyway, speaking of lies brings me to the third part of the show today. You might not be aware of this, but Nicola Sturgeon is no longer the First Minister of Scotland. The First Minister of Scotland is now Ruth Davidson. In an American magazine poll, Ruth Davidson was in the top 10 most influential people in the world, and in I think 3 different quotations in 3 different websites, she was quoted as the Scottish First Minister Ruth Davidson. How did Ruth Davidson get onto a popularity list in a magazine like Time in America? How did she even get her name there? And how did they come to the conclusion or come to the impression that she was somehow the First Minister of Scotland? Where did that come from? There's a lot of disinformation about, and those of you this morning who've seen this story for the first time are probably just laughing at it. But this is quite serious. Our First Minister is Nicola Sturgeon, and the American press is reporting it as Ruth Davidson 3 different times. They haven't even got the facts right about who she is and what party she's from, and the fact that she's the leader of absolutely sod all in Scotland, apart from a handful of Tories. 13 MPs she's got now. Anyway, I digress. But the point is that the lies just keep rolling on and on and on. The media just continues to churn out this utter guff day in, day out, trying to convince people that this is the truth, while in reality they're losing the battle of Brexit in Ireland. And we now have a situation where Britain is going to be forced this summer to admit that Brexit is going to be a fully blown hard Brexit with no safety net, no trade deal whatsoever, and there will be tariffs on all our goods. Because the Europeans are not going to give them any other choice. Why the hell would they? The Europeans didn't decide to throw Britain out of the EU. Britain's throwing itself out of the EU. And then it's moaning that it's causing problems in Ireland. And oh dear me, they're going to have a frictionless border and have to invent some futuristic, fictitious new system of monitoring the movements of people and goods across an invisible border. They can't do it. The Europeans know they can't do it, and they've told them, we don't believe you and we don't accept it. They also don't accept that there should be any border across the Irish Sea between the mainland of the United Kingdom and Ireland of any kind. And that leaves the United Kingdom with one single option, and that's hard Brexit or no Brexit, calling it off. And I know pretty much, I think you probably know as well, that there is no way the Tories and the right-wingers and the Brexiteers are going to wear pulling out of Brexit. They can't, they'd lose face, it would look bad, the rest of the world would realise what a bunch of idiots they've been. So they're going to press ahead with this stupidity right up to the bitter end, and probably at the end of the summer, I guess somewhere about August, they'll finally admit that it's going to be a hard Brexit. And that's the point when we'll be voting on our independence. That's the point where all the chickens will have come home to roost. And finally the lies, not necessarily going to stop, but the lies that have been told about Brexit will be completely blown apart. The myths will be busted. The loud explosion of that myth bursting will be heard all over the world. The British government is already seen as a laughingstock, and it lashing out at the Russians makes it look even sillier, especially after the Skripal non-poisoning case. They're still claiming that there's toxins in Salisbury and they've got to seal off different bits of it to keep this mythology going. There is no poisons in Salisbury, I almost guarantee you. Whatever the Skripals were dosed with to create the illusion of this chemical attack, this weapon attack, it certainly wasn't a nerve agent that's dangerous to the public. So many people were involved in treating those two in the ambulance and at the scene. The only person who was partly contaminated apparently was a policeman. Have we heard from him? No. Is he allowed to be interviewed on the television? No. Has anybody ever seen a picture of him? No. Has anybody heard from the Skripals? No. Where are they? Nobody knows. Right, everything has just disappeared and we're just expected to keep believing the mythology. We are really taken as idiots by both the press and the people who are using the press to basically steer public opinion. By the end of this summer, you'll know for sure what the truth actually is about Brexit, and I'm pretty certain it's going to be extremely nasty. And when we find out just how nasty it is, that's when the referendum will be held, or called for Scotland to leave the UK. Because if we don't do it now, we'll never do it. There'll never be a better time to leave the UK than right at the moment of hard Brexit. Hard Brexit is the deal breaker as far as the UK is concerned. There cannot be a United Kingdom when one part of the kingdom is able to wreck the economy of another part. Now remember, Scotland and England are countries. Scotland isn't a region, Scotland isn't a province, it's not a principality, it's not under English control. Scotland's a country that entered into a union with another country under treaties, which, believe it or not, are about to be broken this week if the so-called Supreme Court rules that the Scottish Continuity Bill, which was passed by a big majority in Holyrood by all parties except the Tories, remember, only the Tories did not vote for it, passed the Scottish Parliament. If it is ruled to be not in the competence of the Scottish Parliament, then that will break one of the fundamental rules, or one of the fundamental clauses in the Treaty of Union, which is that Scottish law, it has precedence in Scottish matters. Affairs of Scotland are decided under Scottish law, affairs in England under English law, and the two systems are equal. There is no superior court, there is no Supreme Court in Britain. There are just the courts of session and the High Court in England. That's it. The Supreme Court was created by Tony Blair illegally, breaking another clause of the Treaties of Union when he came to power. And this was an effort to try and rein in any attempt by Scotland to break free of the Union. So we live in interesting times, and we will wait to see what the so-called Supreme Court decides. I'm willing to bet you that they're going to rule that Scotland cannot pass this kind of law, which is going to create the constitutional crisis that I'm expecting to happen this summer. Is going to deepen the divisions between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. So it's not going to get better. We're going for a hard Brexit. I predict it will be a hard Brexit because the Europeans have now cut off the last possibility of staying in the customs union, because there's no way the United Kingdom can give Ireland the ability, or Northern Ireland the ability, to stay in the customs union and not give it to Scotland. And they're not going to give it to Scotland because then they'd have to give it to parts of England, and they can't do that either because that would cause more grief and more division. Brexit is the gift that just keeps on giving more and more disaster for the United Kingdom. It cuts the United Kingdom up into its constituent pieces very neatly, divides it pretty much along national borders, and says all of the four parts of the United Kingdom do not agree on Brexit, and therefore the parts of the United Kingdom that want to leave Europe will have to do that on their own, and the United Kingdom will have to come apart in order for the democratic will of the various electorates in the four different parts of the UK. In order for them to have their wishes met, the UK must be disbanded, it must be broken up. This was not the doing of the Scottish people, this was the doing of England. England has decided to remove itself from Europe, and by doing that it's basically destroyed the Act of Union by breaking the treaties, that it signed with Scotland 300 years ago. So, as I say, interesting times. The British media at the moment are a joke. I can't take anything that they report seriously. Virtually every day there's some new attempt to make Scotland seem bad, unhealthy, crime-ridden, you name it. It goes on and on and on and on and on. And frankly, it's just tiresome now. You know, you might as well just watch a soap opera. It would probably be more truth in it. So that's the show for today. But to end the week on a high note, I'm predicting that there will be a hard Brexit. This is not a good bit of news, by the way, but it's a positive piece of news in terms of independence, because it drives Scotland away from England, and it cuts off any chance of Scotland maintaining its export orders and keeping its economy buoyant. The Scottish economy is going to be thrown under the bus so that we can please Americans, so that the Americans can trade their poor quality food here, so that they can manufacture Scotch whisky in America, so the brand of Scottish goods is destroyed, so the British government can sell the trademarks of Scottish produce to other manufacturers around the world. 'Cause that's exactly what they will do. All of the things that we hold valuable, most valuable in this country, our identity, our branding, our successful products, all of the things that have brought wealth and prosperity to Scotland will be destroyed and sold off to anybody who wants to buy them. That's the Tory way. If things are looking bad, they have a fire sale of the rest of the UK's assets. They're not going to hurt themselves. They'll hurt Scotland, they'll hurt Northern Ireland, they'll hurt Wales, they'll hurt the West Country, they'll hurt the northeast of England. But the southeast, it'll be fine. It'll be absolutely fine. Their tax havens intact, their millions banked carefully away, their arms manufacturing going like great guns, because they'll be starting more wars to keep feeding it. And it's a future I just don't want any part of, and I certainly don't want my children to have any part of it either. Anyway, my waffle for today is finished, but I still am amazed that Ruth Davidson has suddenly become the First Minister of Scotland overnight. That's quite a remarkable change in fortunes for her. Congratulations, Ruth, on becoming First Minister and being so popular in America. That's wonderful news for you, and I hope to hear your investiture when you're sworn in Holyrood next week, probably, when you're sworn in as the new First Minister. I'd be interested to hear how it was you were elected as well. That should be an interesting story. Okay, we'll see you later. Have a good day, everybody. Have a nice weekend, and I'll speak to you hopefully on Sunday. Bye for now.